She was just 10 years old when she walked out her front door on a Friday morning. 60 minutes later, her mother would make a phone call that would launch one of the most intense manhunts in Colorado history. What investigators discovered would prove that the most dangerous predators don't always look like monsters. Sometimes, they look like someone you'd never suspect. This is the story of Jessica Ridgway, and nothing about it will leave you unchanged. Welcome to the Untold Crime Cases. I'm your host, and what you're about to hear is one of the most heartbreaking cases to ever emerge from Colorado. A case that began with a missing child and ended with a confession that shocked even the most seasoned investigators who thought they'd seen it all. Before we go any further, I need you to do something. If you believe these stories deserve to be told, if you think it's important to remember victims like Jessica, then hit that like button right now. Leave a comment telling me what cases you want to hear next, and subscribe to the Untold Crime Cases because your support is what allows us to keep bringing these crucial stories to light. These aren't just cases. These are real people, real families, real lives that were stolen. Now let's go back to that snowy October morning in Westminster, Colorado, and understand exactly what was taken from this world. October 5th, 2012. A Friday morning in Westminster, Colorado. The season's first snow had fallen overnight, dusting the streets and lawns with a thin white blanket that signaled the coming winter. Inside a single-story home on Moore Street, a 10-year-old girl woke to the sound of her alarm clock. She'd set it herself the night before for 7:45 in the morning because she was that kind of kid. The kind who wanted to be responsible. The kind who was already practicing for the teenager and adult she couldn't wait to become. She got out of bed, turned on the television, and went through her morning routine. She ate breakfast. She got dressed in the clothes she'd laid out the night before. She pulled on her purple-framed glasses because her eyesight wasn't good without them. She bundled up against that first October snow, hoisted her backpack onto her small shoulders, and walked out the front door. Her mother watched her leave, watched her daughter walk down the street toward school, just like she had so many times before. It was 8:54 in the morning when Jessica Ridgway left her house. By 9:55 that same morning, when the school called to report Jessica absent, Sarah Ridgway's world would begin to collapse. And in the hours, days, and weeks that followed, an entire community would learn that sometimes the person you least suspect is the one you should fear most. To understand the magnitude of what was stolen on October 5th, 2012, you need to know who Jessica Christine Ridgway was. Not the victim, not the headline, not the face on the missing person posters that would soon blanket Westminster. You need to know the real girl, the living, breathing, laughing child who had dreams and quirks and a personality that filled every space she entered. Jessica was born on January 23rd, 2002 in Colorado. From the moment she arrived in this world, her family recognized something special about her. They called her an old soul. She had this quality, this way of seeing the world that seemed wise beyond her years. Yet she embraced childhood with complete and total enthusiasm. She didn't rush past being a kid. She lived in it fully while somehow also carrying this deeper understanding of emotions and people that most children her age hadn't developed yet. By the time she reached 10 years old, Jessica had developed a fierce sense of independence. She'd asked her mother Sarah for her own alarm clock because she wanted to wake herself up for school. Think about that for just a moment. Really think about it. How many 10-year-old children voluntarily ask for more responsibility? How many kids that age want to take on tasks that their parents could easily handle for them? But that was Jessica. She was always looking ahead, always preparing, always growing into the person she wanted to be. Jessica lived in that single-story home on Moore Street in Westminster, with her mother Sarah, her grandmother, and her aunt. The household was predominantly female, filled with what family members described as constant conversation, endless laughter, and the particular brand of beautiful chaos that comes when multiple generations live under one roof. There was always someone to talk to, always someone to share a moment with, always voices and activity and life. Her parents, Sarah and Jeremiah Bryant, had separated years before. Her father lived in Independence, Missouri, more than 600 miles away. Despite the distance, and despite some ongoing legal issues regarding child support and custody arrangements, Jessica maintained a relationship with both parents. She knew her father. She talked to him. The separation of her parents didn't mean the end of those connections, even if geography and legal matters complicated things. In fact, a court hearing about child support was scheduled for October 5, 2012, the very day Jessica disappeared. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. We need to stay with who Jessica was before that day came. Jessica attended Witt Elementary School, where she was in the 5th grade. The school served approximately 330 students in the Jefferson County School District. It sat roughly 1 mile from Jessica's home on Moore Street. 1 mile. A distance she walked regularly. Sometimes she walked alone. Sometimes she walked with friends. But it was a familiar route, a path she knew, a journey she'd made countless times without incident. Her teacher, Sheila Grace, knew Jessica as a bright, engaged student. The kind of student teachers appreciate because she participated, because she cared, because she tried. But what stood out even more than her intelligence, even more than her academic performance, was her kindness. Jessica was the type of child who would notice if someone looked sad and go out of her way to cheer them up. She paid attention to other people's feelings. She cared about the emotional state of those around her. At 10 years old, she was already demonstrating empathy in action, not just in words. Her family called her their rock. Think about what that means. The youngest member of the household, and she was the rock. The one people leaned on, the one who provided emotional stability. Jessica had that quality that some people spend their entire lives trying to develop. She sensed emotions in others and responded with genuine empathy. She made people feel seen and heard and valued. At age 10, Jessica was already developing emotional intelligence that many adults never achieve. She was becoming the kind of person who makes the world better simply by existing in it. And that's not hyperbole. That's not an exaggeration born of tragedy. That's who she actually was. Her hobbies painted a picture of a typical American preteen in the early 2010s. She loved Nickelodeon shows, particularly Victorious, and Shake It Up, and Wizards of Waverly Place. These were the shows that filled her afternoons, the characters she connected with, the storylines she followed. Her favorite song was Carly Rae Jepsen's Call Me Maybe, that infectious pop song that dominated radio stations in 2012. She probably sang along to it constantly, probably danced to it in her living room, probably drove her family just a little bit crazy with how often she played it. This detail, this simple fact about her favorite song, would later bring both smiles and tears when it was played at her memorial service. Music has that power. It can transport you back to a person, to a moment, to a feeling. And Call Me Maybe would forever be tied to Jessica Ridgway. Jessica loved to dance. Not formal dance lessons necessarily, though she might have taken those too. But she loved the spontaneous dancing that children do when music plays, the unself-conscious movement that happens when a good song comes on and your body just responds. She would make up her own choreography. She would create her own songs. She would perform little shows for her family, probably demanding that everyone stop what they were doing to watch her latest routine. Can you picture it? A 10-year-old girl in her living room, music playing, moving with complete joy and freedom, performing for an audience of family members who loved her. That was Jessica's life. That was her normal. She loved playing dress-up. She loved caring for her pets. She loved looking after her neighbors' hairless cats, which is such a specific and wonderful detail. Hairless cats aren't common pets, and the fact that Jessica helped care for them shows her willingness to help others, her responsibility, her comfort with animals, even when they weren't the typical fluffy creatures most kids gravitate toward. And then there was purple. Purple was Jessica's absolute favorite color. Not pink, which is what many people might assume for a 10-year-old girl, because society has trained us to associate girls with pink. But Jessica loved purple. Deep, rich, royal purple. The kind of purple that's bold and vibrant and distinctive. She had purple-framed glasses that she wore constantly because her eyesight wasn't good without them. Those glasses were as much a part of her appearance as her blonde hair or her blue eyes. She loved anything and everything purple. Clothes, accessories, decorations, school supplies. If it came in purple, Jessica wanted it. This detail, this simple preference for a particular color, would soon become a symbol of solidarity for an entire community. Purple would become the color of remembrance, the color of hope, the color that tied thousands of people together in collective grief and determination. Physically, Jessica stood 4 feet 10 inches tall and weighed approximately 80 pounds. She was a small girl, even for 10 years old. She had shoulder-length blonde hair that caught the light, the kind of blonde that still held remnants of the almost white blonde many children have when they're younger. She had bright blue eyes that sparkled when she smiled, and she had that distinctive gap between her front 2 teeth that gave her smile extra character. Some kids are self-conscious about gaps in their teeth, but that gap was part of what made Jessica's smile uniquely hers. She had a small bruise on her nose, hidden beneath her glasses frames. The kind of minor childhood injury that happens during active play, during recess, during the normal bumps and scrapes of being a kid who runs and plays and lives fully. Jessica was a member of the Stanley Lake Pee Wee Cheer Clinic. Cheerleading wasn't just an activity for her. It wasn't just something she did on weekends to fill time. It was a passion. It was a dream. She had already announced her future plans to anyone who would listen, with the confidence and certainty that only children possess. She was going to be a high school cheerleader. But not just any cheerleader. She wanted to be, and I quote, a cheerleader who will be kind to everyone. Pause on that for a moment. Really let that sink in. A 10-year-old child dreaming about her teenage years already knew that kindness mattered more than popularity, more than athletic ability, more than being the best or the most talented or the most celebrated. She was setting her own standards for the person she wanted to become, and those standards centered on treating others well. She wanted to use whatever platform or status she might gain as a high school cheerleader to be kind to everyone. Not just the popular kids, not just the other cheerleaders or athletes, everyone. That was Jessica's dream. That was her goal. And she was only 10 years old. Jessica's mother, Sarah Ridgway, worked an overnight shift at a software company in Boulder. Her schedule ran from 10 in the evening until 7 in the morning. It was a difficult arrangement, the kind of schedule that flips your entire life upside down. You sleep when the world is awake. You're awake when the world sleeps. You miss out on evening family dinners and nighttime routines. But it was an arrangement that worked for their family's needs. Perhaps it paid better. Perhaps the hours allowed Sarah to be present during other crucial times of day. Perhaps it was simply the best option available among limited choices. Sarah would return home just as Jessica was waking up. They would spend the morning together as Jessica prepared for school. Mother and daughter time. Conversations over breakfast. help with any last-minute homework questions, the checking of backpacks and the tying of shoes, and all the small rituals that make up a school morning. Then Sarah would sleep while Jessica was in class. She'd wake up around 4 in the afternoon, just in time to greet her daughter when she came home from school, just in time to hear about Jessica's day, to help with homework, to make dinner, to be present for those after-school hours. This routine required trust and responsibility from Jessica. She had to get herself ready in the mornings. She had to manage her time. She had to make sure she had everything she needed for school. She had to walk to school without her mother accompanying her, without that adult presence guiding her every step. For a 10-year-old, this was significant independence. Many kids that age still have parents who walk them to school, or drive them, or wait with them at the bus stop. But Jessica had proven herself capable. She'd shown she could handle this responsibility. The system worked. Day after day, week after week, month after month, Jessica got herself ready and got herself to school and came home safely. The routine was established. The trust was earned. Everything functioned exactly as it should. On Thursday, October 4th, 2012, everything was normal. Jessica went to school. She came home. She did her homework. She played with her pets. She probably watched some television. Maybe she practiced some cheerleading moves in the living room. Maybe she talked to her grandmother or her aunt. Maybe she helped prepare dinner or clean up afterward. It was an unremarkable Thursday, the kind of day that becomes precious only in retrospect, when you realize it was the last normal day you'll ever have, when you understand that the ordinary moments were actually extraordinary because they were the last ones before everything changed forever. That evening, Jessica went to bed at her usual time. She set her alarm clock for 7:45 the next morning. She laid out her clothes for school, planning ahead like the responsible child she was. She was organized. She was prepared. She was doing everything right. Everything parents hope their children will do. And then she went to sleep, having no idea that she would never sleep in that bed again. Having no idea that the next day would be her last. Having no idea that evil was already planning, already waiting, already preparing to destroy everything she was and everything she would ever become. Friday, October 5th, 2012 began exactly as every other school day began in the Ridgeway household. Jessica's alarm went off at 7:45 in the morning. She turned it off, got out of bed, and began her morning routine. Her mother, Sarah, had just returned home from her overnight shift at the software company in Boulder. She was tired from working all night. But she was there. She was present. She spent the morning with her daughter, just like always. Jessica turned on the television. She ate breakfast. She got dressed in the outfit she'd selected the night before. She pulled on her backpack. She put on her purple-framed glasses. She bundled up against the cold because Westminster had received its first snow of the season overnight. Nothing heavy, just a light dusting that covered the grass and the streets and reminded everyone that winter was coming. The kind of first snow that's actually kind of exciting when you're 10 years old, because it signals the approaching holidays and the possibility of snow days off from school. At 8:54 in the morning, Jessica Ridgway walked out the front door of her home on Moore Street. She was wearing a black hooded jacket over a purple shirt, because of course she was wearing purple. She had on dark-colored jeans and black boots. Her backpack was secured on her shoulders. Her glasses were on her face. She looked like any other elementary school student heading to class on a Friday morning. Sarah watched her daughter leave. She watched Jessica walk down the street, heading in the direction of Witt Elementary School, 1 mile away. Sarah had no reason to worry. This was routine. This was normal. Jessica had made this walk countless times before. The route was familiar. The distance was manageable. Jessica was responsible and capable and aware. Sarah went to bed, exhausted from her overnight shift, confident that her daughter would arrive at school safely, just like she always did. But Jessica never made it to school. At 9:55 in the morning, Approximately 1 hour after Jessica left her house, Witt Elementary School made a phone call. Jessica Ridgway had been marked absent. She hadn't shown up for class. The school was calling to verify whether Jessica was sick at home or if there was some other explanation for her absence. Sarah Ridgway woke up to that phone call. And in that moment, in that single horrible moment of realization, her world began to crumble. Jessica wasn't sick. Jessica wasn't home. Jessica had left for school. Jessica should be there. Jessica should be sitting in her 5th grade classroom right now, learning and participating, and being the bright, kind student her teacher knew her to be. Sarah immediately called the Westminster Police Department. It was 10:15 in the morning. Jessica had been missing for approximately 1 hour and 21 minutes. 1 hour and 21 minutes. That's how long it took for a routine morning walk to school to become a parent's worst nightmare. The initial police response treated this as a possible runaway situation. 10-year-old girl, didn't show up at school. Parents are separated. There's a court hearing scheduled for that very day regarding child support. Maybe Jessica was upset about the family situation. Maybe she'd run away. Maybe she was hiding somewhere. Maybe this would resolve quickly with a found child and a family counseling referral. But Sarah Ridgway knew better. She knew her daughter. Jessica wouldn't run away. Jessica was responsible. Jessica was excited about school. Jessica had cheerleading practice to look forward to. Jessica had no reason to run, and every reason to be exactly where she was supposed to be. This wasn't a runaway situation. Something was wrong. Something was terribly, horribly wrong. Police began canvassing the neighborhood immediately. They went door to door, asking if anyone had seen Jessica that morning. They retraced the route Jessica would have taken from her house to Witt Elementary School. They searched yards and checked parks, and looked in any place a child might hide or take shelter. They interviewed Jessica's family, her friends, her classmates, trying to piece together any information that might explain her disappearance. By that afternoon, the case had escalated. This wasn't being treated as a runaway anymore. This was a missing child. This was an endangered child. This was an active crisis that required immediate and extensive resources. The FBI became involved. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation joined the search. Multiple law enforcement agencies coordinated their efforts. This was now one of the largest missing child investigations Colorado had seen in years. An Amber Alert was issued. Jessica's face appeared on television screens across Colorado and beyond. Her description circulated through every possible channel. 10 years old, 4 feet 10 inches, 80 pounds, blonde hair, blue eyes, purple-framed glasses. Last seen wearing a black jacket, purple shirt, dark jeans, black boots. 1 mile between her home and school. Disappeared somewhere along that route on Friday morning, October 5th, 2012. The community response was immediate and overwhelming. Westminster residents organized volunteer search parties. Hundreds of people showed up to help look for Jessica. They searched parks and open spaces. They walked through neighborhoods calling her name. They checked dumpsters and abandoned buildings, and any location where a child might be hidden or held. They distributed flyers. They knocked on doors. They refused to give up hope. Jessica's family held a press conference, pleading for information. Sarah Ridgway stood before cameras and microphones, exhausted and terrified, begging anyone with knowledge of her daughter's whereabouts to come forward. Jessica's father, Jeremiah, traveled from Missouri to Colorado to join the search efforts. Whatever issues existed between the parents, whatever legal disputes were ongoing, none of that mattered now. All that mattered was finding Jessica. The days began to blur together. Friday turned into Saturday, turned into Sunday. 72 hours missing. Then 96 hours. Then more. Each passing hour decreased the likelihood of finding Jessica alive, though no one wanted to say that out loud. The official message remained hopeful. Keep searching. keep looking. Bring Jessica home. Tips poured into law enforcement from the public. Every tip had to be investigated. Every lead had to be followed. Someone thought they saw a girl matching Jessica's description at a gas station. Someone else reported a suspicious vehicle in the neighborhood. Another person remembered seeing something odd near the school that morning. Police chased down every single report, knowing that one of these tips might be the one that led them to Jessica. The community rallied in visible ways. Purple ribbons appeared everywhere, tied to trees, attached to mailboxes, worn on lapels. Purple had been Jessica's favorite color, and now purple became the symbol of hope for her safe return. Homes displayed purple lights. Businesses hung purple banners. Strangers wore purple clothing in solidarity. The entire community was drowning in purple, united in their desperate wish to bring one little girl home. On October 8, 2012, 3 days after Jessica disappeared, someone found a pair of glasses. Purple-framed glasses. Jessica's glasses. They were located in a field in Superior, Colorado, approximately 6 miles from where Jessica was last seen. 6 miles from her home. 6 miles from her school. 6 miles from everything familiar. The discovery of the glasses changed everything. Finding Jessica's glasses in a field 6 miles away meant this wasn't a case of a child who'd gotten lost on her walk to school. This wasn't a case of a child who'd wandered off and couldn't find her way back. This was evidence that Jessica had been taken somewhere. This was proof that someone had abducted her and transported her to a different location. This was confirmation of everyone's worst fears. Law enforcement intensified their efforts. The search area expanded dramatically. If Jessica's glasses were found 6 miles away, she could be anywhere. The radius of possibility had just grown exponentially. More officers, more volunteers, more resources, more everything, but also more dread, because everyone knew what finding evidence of abduction usually meant. Everyone understood that the clock was ticking and that time was not on their side. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with, "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. These cases need to be told. These victims deserve to be remembered. On October 10, 2012, 5 days after Jessica disappeared, someone walking in a field near Patridge Open Space in Arvada, Colorado, made a discovery that would end all hope. They found human remains, the remains of a child. The location was approximately 7 miles from Jessica's home, 7 miles from the last place she was seen alive, 7 miles from the route she should have taken to school on that Friday morning. The remains were not intact. This was not a body that had simply been left in a field. This was evidence of something far more horrific. The remains had been dismembered. Whoever killed Jessica Ridgway had not only taken her life, but had also attempted to hide what they'd done by cutting her body into pieces. The identification process took time. DNA testing was required to confirm what everyone already feared in their hearts. On October 13, 2012, 8 days after Jessica disappeared, the official confirmation came. The remains found in Arvada were Jessica Ridgway. The 10-year-old girl who'd walked out of her house on October 5th was never coming home. The search for a missing child was over. The hunt for a killer had begun. The community's response to Jessica's death was profound and heartbreaking. The purple ribbons that had represented hope now represented grief. The volunteers who had searched tirelessly for a living child now mourned a life that had been stolen. Vigils were held. Memorial services were planned. And through it all, one question dominated every conversation, every news report, every law enforcement briefing. Who did this? Who took Jessica? Who killed her? Who was capable of abducting a 10-year-old girl on her way to school and murdering her in such a horrific manner? The investigation became a manhunt. Police had evidence. They had Jessica's glasses found in Superior. They had her remains found in Arvada. They had the route she would have taken from home to school. They had a timeline. They had witness statements from neighbors who might have seen something that morning. They had forensic evidence from the remains. All of this information needed to be analyzed, cross-referenced, and investigated. One of the most crucial pieces of evidence was DNA. Touch DNA. The kind of DNA evidence that comes from skin cells left behind when someone touches an object. When Jessica's glasses were found in that field in Superior, they were collected as evidence. And on those glasses, investigators found touch DNA that did not belong to Jessica. Someone else had touched those glasses. Someone else had handled them. Someone whose DNA was now in the system, waiting to be matched to a suspect. Law enforcement also had to consider victimology. Who was, or Jessica? Who were her connections? Who had access to her? Who knew her routine? Who knew she walked to school alone each morning? Predators often choose victims based on opportunity and vulnerability. A 10-year-old girl walking alone to school in the early morning hours would certainly fit that profile. The investigation looked at registered sex offenders in the area. They looked at anyone with a history of crimes against children. They looked at family members and family friends, and anyone who might have known Jessica or known about her. They collected DNA samples from potential suspects. They interviewed hundreds of people. They pursued every possible angle. And then they caught a break, a massive, case-solving break. On October 17, 2012, 12 days after Jessica disappeared, and 4 days after her body was officially identified, a woman in the neighboring city of Superior, Colorado, called police to report an attempted abduction. A woman said she'd been jogging on a trail when someone tried to attack her. She fought back. She escaped. And she provided a description of her attacker. This attempted abduction happened approximately 6 miles from where Jessica was last seen. 6 miles from where her glasses were found. The proximity was too close to be coincidental. Law enforcement immediately saw the connection. They had a child abduction and murder in Westminster. They had an attempted adult abduction in Superior. The locations overlapped. The timing was close. This couldn't be unrelated. The jogger's description of her attacker and the details she provided led investigators to focus on a specific area of Superior. They began canvassing that neighborhood. They started looking for anyone who matched the description. They were closing in. On October 19, 2012, 14 days after Jessica disappeared, police executed a search warrant at a home in Superior, Colorado. The home belonged to a 17-year-old named Austin Reed Sigg and his mother. Austin was a student. He was a teenager. He was someone who, by all outward appearances, seemed like a normal kid from a normal family, living a normal life in a normal neighborhood. He was not a registered sex offender. He had no criminal history. He had no prior contact with law enforcement. He was not on anyone's radar as a dangerous individual. But inside his home, investigators found evidence that would prove Austin Reed Sigg was anything but normal. They found Jessica's backpack, the backpack she'd been wearing when she left for school on October 5th, the backpack that should have been with her at Witt Elementary School. It was in Austin Sigg's house. They found evidence of the attempted abduction of the jogger, materials and items that linked Austin to that attack. They found other disturbing evidence that painted a picture of a deeply troubled and dangerous individual. Evidence that suggested this might not be his first violent act. Evidence that indicated a fascination with death and violence that went far beyond normal teenage curiosity. Austin Reed Sigg was arrested. He was taken into custody and interrogated. And then, in a move that shocked investigators, he confessed. Not after hours of questioning. Not after lawyers got involved. Not after a lengthy legal battle. He simply confessed. Austin admitted to abducting Jessica Ridgway. He admitted to killing her. He admitted to dismembering her body in an attempt to hide what he'd done. He provided details about the crime that only the person responsible could know. Details about where he took her. Details about what he did. Details that turned the stomachs of even the most experienced homicide detectives. On October 20th, 2012, 15 days after Jessica disappeared, police held a press conference announcing they'd made an arrest in her murder. The community that had been living in fear finally had an answer. They had a name. They had a suspect in custody. They had justice, or at least the beginning of justice. But the arrest of Austin Reed Sigg raised as many questions as it answered. Who was this teenager? How did he cross paths with Jessica? Why did he target her? What motivated him to commit such a horrific crime? And perhaps most disturbing of all, how did a 17-year-old with no criminal history suddenly become capable of kidnapping, murdering, and dismembering a child? To understand what happened to Jessica Ridgway, we need to understand who Austin Reed Sigg was. Born in July 1995, Austin was 17 years old when he killed Jessica. He lived in Superior, Colorado, with his mother, Mindy Sigg. His parents were divorced. He had a relatively normal childhood by most accounts. He attended school. He had friends, though perhaps not as many as some teenagers. He was intelligent, reportedly having a high IQ. He was interested in mortuary science and had expressed a desire to work in that field. By itself, an interest in mortuary science isn't concerning. Many people pursue careers working with the deceased. But combined with everything else that would later be discovered about Austin, this interest takes on a more sinister tone. Austin was described by some as quiet and socially awkward. He didn't play sports. He wasn't particularly outgoing. He spent a lot of time alone, often in his room, often on the computer. Again, none of this is inherently concerning. Many teenagers are introverted. Many teenagers prefer solitary activities. Many teenagers go through phases where they're more comfortable alone than in social situations. But Austin's alone time wasn't spent on typical teenage pursuits. He wasn't just playing video games or watching movies or chatting with friends online. He was spending his time in much darker places. Austin had been researching murder. He'd been looking up information about serial killers. He'd been studying cases of child abduction and murder. He'd been exploring violent and disturbing content online. He'd been fantasizing about committing acts of violence himself. This wasn't a passing curiosity. This wasn't a teenager reading true crime books or watching crime documentaries. This was obsessive research with a clear purpose. Austin wasn't just interested in violence, he was preparing for it. In the months before October 5th, 2012, Austin Reed Sigg had been planning to kill someone. He'd been thinking about how to do it. He'd been considering different methods. He'd been identifying potential victims. He'd been preparing himself mentally for what it would feel like to take another person's life. This wasn't an impulsive act. This wasn't a moment of rage or a crime of passion. This was premeditated murder. This was a calculated decision to end someone's life. On the morning of October 5th, Austin woke up and decided that this was the day. He later told investigators that he'd been driving around Westminster looking for someone to abduct. He was hunting. He was actively searching for a victim. And then he saw Jessica Ridgway walking to school. Jessica was alone. She was small. She was vulnerable. She was exactly what Austin was looking for. He pulled up next to her, somehow convinced her to get into his vehicle, and drove away with her. We don't know exactly what he said to get her into the car. We don't know if he claimed to be lost and asked for directions. We don't know if he said he was a friend of her mother's. We don't know if he physically forced her into the vehicle. What we do know is that Jessica, a responsible and aware 10-year-old who knew stranger danger, ended up in Austin Sigg's car. And once she was in that car, she had no chance of escape. Austin drove Jessica to his home in Superior. His mother was not there. He had the house to himself. He took Jessica inside, and there, in his home, he killed her. The specific details of how he killed her have been kept from public reports, likely to spare Jessica's family additional trauma. But we know that her death was violent. We know that she suffered. We know that this 17-year-old murdered a 10-year-old child in his own home. And then Austin did something that reveals just how disturbed and dangerous he truly was. He dismembered Jessica's body. He cut her remains into pieces. He did this in his home, in his bathroom, calmly and methodically. He put some of her remains into garbage bags. He transported these bags to different locations around the area. He left her remains in a field in Arvada. He left her glasses in a field in Superior. He tried to scatter the evidence, to make it harder for police to find her, to make it harder to identify her, to make it harder to connect her death to him. After killing Jessica, Austin cleaned up. He tried to remove evidence from his home. He disposed of materials. He attempted to cover his tracks. And then he went back to his normal life. He went to school. He interacted with his mother. He maintained the appearance of a typical teenager. He watched the news coverage of Jessica's disappearance. He saw the community searching for her. He saw her family pleading for information. And he said nothing. He did nothing. He let everyone continue searching for a girl he knew was dead because he had killed her. On October 1st, 2013, Austin Reed Sigg stood before Judge Stephen Munsinger in Jefferson County District Court and pleaded guilty. He pleaded guilty to 15 charges in total: first-degree murder, sexual assault of a minor, second-degree kidnapping, attempted kidnapping, attempted sexual assault, sexual exploitation of a minor, multiple counts of crime of violence. He pleaded guilty to everything. Against the advice of his attorneys, without any plea bargain, without any deal that would reduce his charges or his potential sentence, Austin admitted his guilt. The district attorney made clear that no charges were dismissed as part of a plea agreement. No concessions were made. Austin was taking full responsibility for everything he'd done. The only reason 3 counts of felony murder merged into the first-degree murder count was a legal technicality. A person can only be convicted and sentenced for murdering another person once, even if multiple legal theories support that murder charge. Why did Austin plead guilty? Why give up any chance at trial, any possibility of creating reasonable doubt, any opportunity for his defense team to argue for reduced charges or lesser sentences? We can't know for certain. Perhaps he understood that the evidence against him was overwhelming. Perhaps he knew that putting Jessica's family through a trial would only add to their suffering. Perhaps, in some small way, he felt genuine remorse for what he'd done. Or perhaps he simply wanted to maintain control over the narrative, wanted to tell his story in his own words, rather than having it presented by prosecutors and witnesses. Whatever his reasons, Austin's guilty plea meant that the proceedings would move directly into the sentencing phase. There would be no trial, no parade of witnesses, no presentation of evidence to a jury. Just a hearing where the judge would determine Austin's punishment within the confines of Colorado law. The sentencing hearing took place on November 18th and 19th, 2013. It lasted 2 days. The courtroom was packed with Jessica's family members and loved ones, with community members who had followed this case from the beginning, with media from across the country. Everyone wanted to see justice served. Everyone wanted to hear what punishment would be imposed on the teenager who had destroyed so many lives. During those 2 days of testimony, the full horror of Austin's crimes was laid bare. Forensic experts described the evidence. Psychologists testified about Austin's mental state. investigators detailed his confession. And through it all, Austin sat mostly expressionless, staring forward, showing little emotion. Dr. Anna Salter, a psychologist who had reviewed Austin's case, testified that although she had never formally examined him, the evidence suggested he had psychopathic tendencies. She stopped short of calling him a full psychopath, but she had no hesitation in describing him as sadistic and necrophiliac. She told the court that Austin's pornography viewing habits and his behavior indicated sexual arousal from causing pain and from contact with dead bodies. She explained that while Austin committed his crimes as a juvenile, they did not meet the typical markers of adolescent crime. There was no impulsivity. There was no seeking of peer approval. This was calculated, planned, methodical violence. Chief Deputy District Attorney Hal Sargent struggled visibly as he described Jessica's final hours. He explained how Austin had waited in the back seat of his vehicle, watching Jessica walk down the sidewalk, how he'd grabbed her when she walked past his car, how he'd bound her arms and legs and thrown her into the back seat, how he'd driven her to his home and taken her to his bedroom. Sargent's voice broke as he described what happened next. Jessica's mother, Sarah Ridgway, had already left the courtroom. She couldn't bear to hear the details of her daughter's last moments. But other family members remained. Soft sobs and sniffles echoed through the packed courtroom as Sargent continued. Sargent told the court that he did not want to detail how Austin had methodically dismembered Jessica. Some horrors are too great to speak aloud, especially in front of the victim's family. But Sargent made clear that Austin had told police he was fulfilling a sexual fantasy, that Austin had kept parts of Jessica's body as trophies, that Austin had demonstrated a level of depravity that shocked even the most experienced homicide investigators. Then Sargent read Austin's own words, the words Austin had spoken to investigators during his confession. Quote, "There is no better word to describe what I have done than evil." End quote. That was Austin's own assessment of his actions, not remorse, not apology, just a cold acknowledgement of the evil he had committed. The prosecution played a video featuring photographs of Jessica, images of her smiling, laughing, living the life that Austin had stolen, images of a little girl who loved to dance and make up words and wear purple glasses, a little girl who wanted to be a kind cheerleader, a little girl who had been the rock of her family. As the video played, Austin appeared to weep, whether those were tears of genuine remorse or simply tears of self-pity. No one could say for certain. Jessica's mother, Sarah Ridgway, provided a victim impact statement. But she didn't address it to Austin. She made that choice deliberately and publicly. Quote, "I don't think that the defendant has a right to hear how he's affected me," end quote, she told the court. She refused to give Austin the satisfaction of hearing about her pain. Instead, she spoke about Jessica's legacy, about the little girl who had brought joy and light to everyone who knew her. She told the courtroom, quote, "Once we walk out of this courtroom, we will no longer remember his name, only the legacy Jessica left behind." End quote. It was a powerful statement, a refusal to let Austin's evil overshadow Jessica's goodness, a determination to remember the victim rather than obsessing over the perpetrator. Sarah Ridgway was taking back her power in the only way she could. She was choosing how Jessica would be remembered. She was ensuring that her daughter's story would be about who Jessica was, not about how she died. Austin's attorneys made their final arguments. They emphasized his youth, his difficult birth, his childhood medical issues, his family history of mental illness. They argued that Austin deserved the minimum sentence allowed by law. They suggested that despite the horrific nature of his crimes, he was still a child who deserved some measure of mercy. The prosecution's response was devastating. Chief Deputy District Attorney Sargent pointed out that Austin had meticulously planned his attacks, that he'd researched methods of abduction and murder, that he'd learned from his failed attempt at Kettner Lake and adjusted his victim selection accordingly, that he'd demonstrated clear understanding of right and wrong by his efforts to hide evidence and avoid detection. Sargent argued, quote, "It's a chilling thought to think of what a fully matured Austin Sigg is capable of." End quote. Then it was time for Judge Stephen Munsinger to impose sentence. Munsinger began by thanking Austin for pleading guilty, for sparing Jessica's family the additional trauma of a trial, for accepting responsibility for his actions, even if that acceptance came only after he was caught. But Munsinger made clear that gratitude for the guilty plea would not translate into leniency in sentencing. Judge Munsinger read a statement that Austin had written. In it, Austin referred to himself as a monster. Quote, "I don't know about society because I've never really been that great with it, but I know that personally I am a monster. There's no better word to describe what I've done than evil." End quote. Then Munsinger delivered his judgment. Quote, "Evil is apparently real," end quote, the judge said. Quote, "It was present in our community on October 5th, 2012. On that day, its name was Austin Sigg." End quote. Munsinger imposed the maximum sentence allowed by Colorado law. For the first-degree murder of Jessica Ridgway, Austin received life in prison. Under Colorado law, because Austin was 17 years old at the time of the murder, he would be eligible for parole after 40 years. The United States Supreme Court had ruled in Roper v. Simmons that offenders under age 18 cannot be sentenced to death. Additionally, Colorado law mandates that juveniles sentenced to life imprisonment must be given the possibility of parole after 40 years. But Judge Munsinger wasn't finished. He went through each of the 15 counts Austin had pleaded guilty to, and for many of them, he imposed the maximum allowable sentence. 32 years for sexual assault on a child, 24 years for second-degree kidnapping, 16 years for robbery, 12 years for attempted first-degree murder of the jogger at Kettner Lake, 12 years for attempted second-degree kidnapping of that same victim, and on through all 15 counts. Then came the critical part. Munsinger ordered that these sentences run consecutively, not concurrently. Austin would serve his life sentence with eligibility for parole after 40 years. But once he became eligible for that parole, he would still have to serve an additional 86 years in prison before he could be considered for release. 86 more years on top of the 40-year minimum for the murder conviction. In practical terms, Judge Munsinger had ensured that Austin Reed Sigg would never leave prison. Even if he lived to be eligible for parole on the murder charge at age 57, he would then have to serve until age 143 before completing his full sentence. It was a life sentence in every meaningful sense, a guarantee that Austin would die in prison. Austin's defense attorneys objected. They argued that the sentence was cruel and unusual punishment. They contended that such a lengthy sentence for a juvenile offender violated constitutional principles. But Judge Munsinger dismissed their arguments. Quote, "This case cries out for a life sentence," end quote, he stated. The law allowed him to impose these consecutive sentences. The law allowed him to ensure that Austin would never walk free. And that's exactly what he did. As Munsinger read through the sentences, Austin stared forward. He didn't look back at Jessica's family sitting behind him. He didn't look at his own mother, Mindy, who sat sobbing through the gruesome details of her son's crimes, but who had composed herself by the time sentencing was announced. Austin showed no visible emotion as he learned he would spend the rest of his life in prison. No tears, no outrage, no plea for mercy. Just that same blank stare he'd maintained throughout most of the proceedings. After the sentencing, District Attorney Pete Weir held a press conference. He acknowledged that even with the full weight of the law brought to bear on Austin Sigg, it wasn't enough. Quote, "The damage, the hurt, the loss remains," end quote, Weir said. Quote, "We hope for closure for families, but at times, I think that's a hollow term. The full weight of the law has come to bear on Austin Sigg. It's not enough. More is needed, but it's all we can do." End quote. That's the truth that everyone involved in this case had to accept. No sentence, no matter how severe, could bring Jessica back. No punishment, no matter how fitting, could undo the horror she experienced. No amount of justice could heal the wound that Austin had inflicted on Jessica's family and on the entire community. All they could do was ensure that Austin would never hurt anyone else again. All they could do was remember Jessica for who she was, not for how she died. In June 2014, Austin Reed Sigg was transferred to an undisclosed out-of-state prison. Colorado officials made this decision for safety reasons. Given the high-profile nature of his crime, given the intense hatred directed toward him, officials determined it would be safer for everyone involved if Austin served his sentence far from Colorado. The specific location of his incarceration has never been publicly revealed. He remains there today, serving his life sentence, plus 86 years, with no realistic possibility of ever being released. But what about Jessica's legacy? How do we remember a child whose life was stolen so brutally? How do we ensure that she's defined by her 10 years of life, rather than by the circumstances of her death? The community of Westminster answered that question in the most beautiful way possible. In the location where Jessica was supposed to meet her friends on the morning of October 5, 2012, the community established the Jessica Ridgway Memorial Park. This park serves as a space for reflection and remembrance. It incorporates butterflies and the color purple throughout its design, capturing Jessica's playful spirit and honoring her favorite color. The park features playground equipment where children can play and laugh and experience the joy that Jessica should have gotten to experience for decades longer. It has open spaces for recreation. It has quiet areas for meditation and reflection. It's a place where people of all ages can come together, where the community can heal, where Jessica's memory can live on in a setting of beauty rather than tragedy. Every year on Jessica's birthday, January 23rd, and on the anniversary of her disappearance, October 5th, community members gather at the park. They release purple butterflies. They share memories. They celebrate the life of a little girl who touched so many people in her brief time on Earth. They ensure that Jessica Ridgway is remembered as she truly was. A kind, loving, responsible child with dreams and potential. A little girl who wanted to be a cheerleader, who would be kind to everyone. Jessica's case also led to significant changes in how communities respond to child abductions. The massive search effort that involved more than 1,000 volunteers and 75 law enforcement agencies became a model for future investigations. The use of social media to spread information about missing children was refined and improved based on lessons learned from Jessica's case. The community's response, with those purple ribbons and purple lights and purple clothing, demonstrated the power of visible solidarity in missing persons cases. Schools across Colorado updated their safety protocols. Parents had difficult conversations with their children about stranger danger, about the importance of walking in groups, about what to do if approached by someone suspicious. No one wanted to steal children's innocence by making them fearful of their own neighborhoods. But everyone wanted to ensure that no other child would suffer Jessica's fate. The case also highlighted the importance of early intervention when children display concerning behaviors. Austin Sigg's addiction to violent pornography began at age 12. His mother discovered it and got him into therapy. But that therapy was ineffective because Austin was dishonest about his progress. He told his therapist and his family what they wanted to hear, while his addiction and his violent fantasies continued to escalate. Could this tragedy have been prevented if Austin's issues had been addressed more effectively? If the therapy had been more intensive? If his violent fantasies had been taken more seriously? We can't know for certain. But what we do know is that warning signs existed years before Austin killed Jessica. And those warning signs were either missed or inadequately addressed. This doesn't excuse Austin's choices. He knew right from wrong. He understood that what he was planning was evil. He acknowledged as much in his own words. But it does raise important questions about how we identify and intervene with troubled adolescents before they become dangerous adults. Jessica's story also reminds us of the courage it takes to do the right thing, even when that right thing causes unimaginable pain. Mindy Sigg turned in her own son. She called the police and told them that Austin had confessed to murdering Jessica. She made that call, knowing it would destroy her family, knowing her son would spend the rest of his life in prison, knowing she would be forever known as the mother of a child killer. But she did it anyway, because it was the right thing to do, because Jessica's family deserved answers, because the community deserved justice, because allowing Austin to continue living freely would mean risking other lives. Robert Sigg, Austin's father, later released a statement acknowledging his ex-wife's courage. Quote, "There are no words to express the sorrow that I and my family feel for their pain. I also ask for your prayers and support for Austin's mother, whose courageous act has put this tragedy on the path to resolution." End quote. That courage, that willingness to sacrifice everything for the truth, stands in stark contrast to Austin's cowardice. Austin spent more than 2 weeks watching a community search desperately for Jessica. He watched her family plead for information. He watched volunteers walk through neighborhoods calling her name. He saw the purple ribbons and the vigils and the grief. And he said nothing. He let everyone suffer while he alone knew where Jessica was and what had happened to her. He only confessed after his mother forced the issue. Even then, his confession came not from conscience, but from the realization that he was about to be caught. So where does this leave us? What do we take away from the story of Jessica Ridgway? First, we remember Jessica, not as a victim, not as a statistic, but as a real child who had dreams and personality and potential. A girl who loved purple and wanted to be a kind cheerleader. A daughter who was her family's rock. A friend who would go out of her way to cheer up someone who looked sad. A student who was bright and engaged and empathetic beyond her years. That's who Jessica was. That's who we should remember. Second, we acknowledge the reality that evil exists, not supernatural evil, not the evil of monsters and horror stories, but the very human evil of people who choose to cause harm, people who let their darkest impulses control their actions, people who see other human beings as objects that exist for their gratification. Austin Sigg chose evil. He spent years fantasizing about violence. He researched methods of abduction and murder. He made homemade chloroform. He went hunting for victims. Every step of the way, he could have chosen differently. He could have sought help. He could have talked to someone about his violent fantasies. He could have resisted his impulses. But he didn't. He chose evil. And Judge Munsinger was right to call it what it was. Third, we recognize the importance of community. The response to Jessica's disappearance was extraordinary. More than 1,000 people volunteered to search for her. Strangers walked through neighborhoods for hours, calling her name, checking every possible location. The entire community wore purple in solidarity. They hung ribbons and displayed lights and refused to give up hope even as days passed without any sign of Jessica. That community response didn't save Jessica. Nothing could have saved her once Austin took her. But it mattered. It showed Jessica's family they weren't alone. It demonstrated that their daughter's life had value, that people cared, that the community would do everything possible to bring her home. And after Jessica's body was found, that community support continued. They attended vigils. They contributed to memorial funds. They helped establish the park in Jessica's honor. They ensured that Sarah Ridgway and her family had the support they needed to navigate their grief. Community can't prevent every tragedy, but it can help people survive tragedy when it occurs. Fourth, we must have honest conversations about online content and its impact on developing minds. Austin Sigg became addicted to child pornography at age 12. That addiction progressed to increasingly violent material over the following years. He watched videos of human dismemberment. He consumed content depicting extreme sexual violence. And that consumption of violent content fed his fantasies and ultimately contributed to his decision to act on those fantasies. This isn't an argument for censorship or for eliminating the internet, but it is a recognition that unfettered access to the darkest corners of online content can have devastating consequences, especially for young people whose brains are still developing, whose impulse control isn't fully formed, whose understanding of consequences is incomplete. Parents, educators, and society as a whole need to grapple with these issues honestly. We need to talk with children about what they encounter online. We need to monitor concerning behavior. We need to intervene early when warning signs appear. Fifth, we need to support better mental health services and intervention programs. Austin Sigg received therapy starting at age 12, but that therapy was ineffective because he wasn't honest about his continued consumption of violent pornography or about his violent fantasies. Perhaps if there had been more intensive treatment, perhaps if the therapy had been specifically designed to address his particular pathology, perhaps if there had been better monitoring and follow-up, perhaps things could have been different. We can't know for certain. But we do know that the mental health intervention Austin received did not prevent him from becoming a killer. We need to ask ourselves what more effective intervention might look like. Finally, we need to remember that justice, while necessary and important, can never fully heal the wounds caused by crimes like this. Austin Sigg will spend the rest of his life in prison. He will never walk free. He will never have the opportunity to hurt another person. That's important. That's necessary. But it doesn't bring Jessica back. It doesn't undo the trauma to her family. It doesn't erase the fear that gripped the community during those terrible weeks in October 2012. Justice can hold people accountable. Justice can protect society from dangerous individuals. Justice can provide some measure of closure. But justice cannot undo what has been done. Sarah Ridgway said it best when she told the court that she would no longer remember Austin's name, only Jessica's legacy. That's the choice all of us can make. We can choose to remember Jessica Ridgway as she lived, not as she died. We can choose to honor her memory by being kinder to others, by looking out for vulnerable members of our community, by teaching children about safety without robbing them of their innocence. We can choose to ensure that Jessica's 10 years of life mattered more than the evil that ended those years. On October 5, 2012, Jessica Ridgway walked out her front door on a snowy Friday morning. She was excited about school. She was practicing to be responsible. She was becoming the teenager and adult she so badly wanted to be. She never got the chance to become that person. She never got to be a high school cheerleader who was kind to everyone. She never got to grow up, fall in love, have children of her own, pursue her dreams, experience all the joys and sorrows and adventures that make up a full life. But in her 10 years, Jessica made an impact. She was her family's rock. She was the student who noticed when someone looked sad and went out of her way to cheer them up. She was the little girl who already understood that kindness mattered more than popularity. She was someone who made the world better simply by existing in it. And even though her time was cut brutally short, even though she never got the chance to fulfill her potential, Jessica's impact continues. Through the memorial park that bears her name, through the safety protocols implemented because of her case, through the conversations families had about protecting their children, through the community that came together in her memory, through everyone who was touched by her story and chose to be a little kinder, a little more aware, a little more protective of the vulnerable people in their lives. That's Jessica Ridgway's legacy. Not the circumstances of her death, but the impact of her life. Not the evil that took her, but the good she represented. Not Austin Sigg's name, which we can choose to forget, but Jessica's memory, which we can choose to honor. If this story has affected you, if you're struggling with the weight of what happened to Jessica, please reach out to someone. Talk to a counselor. Connect with a friend. Don't carry this burden alone. And if you have information about any missing person, if you see something that doesn't seem right, if you suspect a child is in danger, speak up. Make that phone call. Take that action. You might be the one who makes the difference between a family finding closure and a family spending years in agonizing uncertainty. This has been The Untold Crime Cases. I'm your host. And this is the story of Jessica Ridgway, a 10-year-old girl with purple glasses and big dreams who deserved so much more than she got. May we remember her always. May we honor her memory by being the kind of people she wanted the world to have more of. Kind people. Aware people. People who look out for each other and protect the vulnerable among us. If this case moved you, if you believe these stories need to be told, do me one last favor. Hit that like button, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, or telling us about Jessica's impact on you. Subscribe to The Untold Crime Cases and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. These aren't just cases. These are real people whose stories deserve to be remembered. Your support helps us continue bringing these important stories to light. Until next time, stay aware, stay safe, and take care of each other. Because you never know when someone might need that kindness that Jessica believed in so deeply. The revelations about Austin's background painted a disturbing picture of a deeply troubled individual. According to unsealed court documents and testimony that would later emerge during legal proceedings, Austin had become addicted to child pornography at age 12. His mother had discovered this addiction and immediately enrolled him in therapy. He attended sessions for years. He told his therapist and his family that the therapy was helping. He presented himself as someone who was working through his issues, someone who was getting better. But it was all a lie. Austin would later admit that the therapy had done nothing. His addiction to increasingly violent pornography continued and escalated. By his own testimony, he had progressed from viewing child pornography to consuming material depicting human dismemberment, sexual bondage, and rape. His addiction, as he described it, resulted in viewing increasingly more violent material at a steady rate. He was desensitizing himself to violence. He was training himself to see human beings as objects that existed for his gratification. Law enforcement found disturbing material on Austin's cell phone and computer, images and videos of human dismemberment, sexual violence, extreme brutality. He'd been researching how to make chloroform. He'd been searching for information about the top 10 places people get abducted. He'd been studying serial killers and their methods. He'd been preparing himself, educating himself, planning for the day when he would act on his fantasies. Austin was attending Arapahoe Community College at the time of Jessica's murder. He was studying mortuary science, the science of preparing and caring for deceased bodies. He'd told people he wanted to work in the funeral industry. On the surface, this could seem like a legitimate career interest. Many people work in mortuary science and funeral services. It's an important profession that serves families during their most difficult moments. But combined with everything else about Austin, his interest in mortuary science takes on a far more sinister meaning. He wasn't interested in helping families honor their dead. He was interested in having access to dead bodies. He was interested in the technical aspects of dismemberment and preservation. His career choice was an extension of his pathology. Now let's go back to that morning of October 5th, 2012. Austin woke up and decided that this was the day he would kill someone. He later told investigators that he'd been planning this for a long time. He'd been thinking about it obsessively. He'd been fantasizing about what it would feel like. And on that Friday morning, he decided to act. Austin got into his vehicle and began driving around Westminster. He was hunting. That's the word he used when he confessed. Hunting. He was looking for a victim. He was searching for someone vulnerable, someone he could overpower, someone he could abduct without being seen. He drove through residential neighborhoods, scanning the streets, looking for opportunity. And then he saw Jessica Ridgway, a 10-year-old girl, 4 feet 10 inches tall, 80 pounds, walking alone on the sidewalk. She was bundled up against the October cold, her backpack on her shoulders, heading toward school. She was catching snowflakes as she walked, enjoying the season's first snow with the innocent joy of a child who doesn't yet understand how dangerous the world can be. Austin parked his vehicle on the street. He positioned himself in the back seat, waiting. He watched Jessica approach. He waited until she was right next to his vehicle. And then he struck. Jessica screamed. Her family had taught her to scream if a stranger ever approached her. She'd even written in her school journal about knowing the world wasn't always safe. She did exactly what she'd been told to do. She screamed, but no one heard her. Or if anyone heard, they didn't react quickly enough. In a matter of seconds, Austin had grabbed Jessica, bound her arms and legs, and thrown her into the back seat of his vehicle. The entire abduction took place within 1,000 feet of Jessica's front door, within 1,000 feet of where her mother was sleeping, having just returned from her overnight shift, within 1,000 feet of safety. Austin drove Jessica to his home in Superior, Colorado, approximately 6 miles away from where he'd taken her. His mother was not there. He had the house to himself. He took Jessica inside, into his bedroom. And there, in that room, he subjected her to horrors that no child should ever experience. According to testimony that would later emerge in court, Austin made Jessica change her clothes. He cut her hair. He was staging her, controlling her, exerting complete power over this terrified child. And then, he strangled her to death. He later told investigators that he knew she was dead the moment he pulled her into his car. He knew from the very beginning that he was going to kill her. There was never any possibility of Jessica surviving this encounter. Austin had made his decision before he ever laid hands on her. But Austin didn't stop with murder. After Jessica was dead, after this child's life had been stolen, Austin dismembered her body. He took her into his bathroom and systematically cut her remains into pieces. He removed her internal organs. He kept her skull. He placed a wooden cross, one he'd crafted himself, inside what remained of her body. He put portions of her remains into black garbage bags. He was methodical. He was calm. He was carrying out what he would later describe as a sexual fantasy. Over the next several days, Austin transported Jessica's remains to different locations. On October 7th, 2 days after he killed her, Austin took Jessica's backpack and deliberately placed it in a subdivision in Superior. Inside the backpack, he put her purple-framed glasses, her socks, her underwear, and other clothing items. He urinated on these items before placing them in the backpack. This wasn't carelessness. This wasn't an accident. According to the chief deputy district attorney who would later prosecute, This case, Austin chose these specific items carefully. The glasses and the urine-soaked clothing were meant to send a message. They were meant to tell investigators that Jessica was dead. Austin wanted law enforcement to know what he'd done. He wanted them to understand the horror of the situation. On October 10th, 5 days after Jessica disappeared, Austin placed her torso inside 2 black garbage bags and left them alongside 82nd Street in the Patridge Park open space in Arvada. This was 9 miles from Jessica's home. 9 miles from where she should have been safe. The location where Austin left Jessica's torso was deliberate and cruel. It was in an open space where it would be found, where the discovery would maximize the trauma to the community and to Jessica's family. While Austin was disposing of Jessica's remains, while he was carefully planning where to leave evidence, an entire community was searching desperately for her. More than 1,000 people were involved in the search efforts. 75 local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies had joined the investigation. Volunteers walked through neighborhoods calling Jessica's name. They searched parks and fields and any location where a child might be hidden. Purple ribbons appeared on every tree, every mailbox, every storefront. The community had united in hope, even as that hope was already gone. Even as Jessica had already been dead for days. Sarah Ridgway, Jessica's mother, held press conferences pleading for information. She stood before cameras, exhausted and terrified, begging anyone with knowledge of her daughter's whereabouts to come forward. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't eat. She couldn't function beyond the singular focus of finding her child. Jeremiah Bryant, Jessica's father, traveled more than 600 miles from Missouri to Colorado to join the search. Whatever disputes existed between Jessica's parents, whatever legal issues were ongoing regarding child support, none of that mattered anymore. All that mattered was finding Jessica, bringing her home. On October 7th, when Jessica's backpack was found in Superior, law enforcement knew they were dealing with an abduction. The location was too far from Jessica's route to school. The contents were too deliberate. This wasn't a case of a child who'd gotten lost or run away. Someone had taken her. Someone had her belongings. Someone was sending a message. Police immediately began processing the evidence from the backpack. They collected DNA samples from the items inside. And when those samples were analyzed, investigators made a crucial connection. The DNA found on Jessica's belongings matched DNA from another case, an attempted abduction that had occurred approximately 4 months earlier on May 28, 2012. On that May evening, a 22-year-old woman had been jogging on trails near Kettner Lake in Westminster. She was exercising, enjoying the evening, completely, unaware that someone was watching her. Suddenly, a man approached her from behind and tried to place a rag soaked with chloroform over her face. The chemical smell was overwhelming. The woman immediately understood she was being attacked. She fought back with everything she had. She struggled. She punched. She kicked. She refused to be overpowered, and she escaped. She ran to safety and immediately called 911. The woman provided police with a description of her attacker. She described him as white or light-skinned, between 18 and 30 years old, with brown hair, approximately 5 feet 8 inches tall. This attack had been investigated, but without a suspect, the case remained unsolved. Until now. Until the DNA from that attempted abduction matched the DNA found on Jessica Ridgway's belongings. Law enforcement now understood they were looking for someone who had attacked before. Someone who had tried to abduct an adult woman, but failed because she was strong enough to fight him off. Someone who had, then, 4 months later, targeted a child. Someone who learned from his failed attempt and adjusted his victim selection accordingly. Someone who realized that a 10-year-old girl would be easier to overpower than a 22-year-old woman. On October 10th, When Jessica's torso was discovered in that field in Arvada, the investigation became a homicide case. The search for a missing child was now a hunt for a killer. The FBI intensified their efforts. More resources poured into Westminster and the surrounding communities. Investigators began collecting DNA samples from men in the area. They were taking hundreds of samples, building a database, hoping to find a match to the DNA evidence they'd collected. On October 17th, 12 days after Jessica disappeared, the FBI received a phone call. A woman contacted them with concerns about a friend's son. She'd seen news coverage about the case. She'd seen a photo that police had released showing a wooden cross that had been found with Jessica's remains, and she recognized that cross. She knew someone who made crosses like that. Someone who wore a cross like that. A 17-year-old named Austin Reed Sigg. This tip gave investigators a new focus. They began looking into Austin Sigg. They learned he lived in Superior, not far from where Jessica's backpack had been found. They learned he'd attended Witt Elementary School as a child, the same school Jessica attended. They learned he was studying mortuary science. They learned he fit the general description from the Kettner Lake attack. Everything was pointing toward this teenager. On October 19th, FBI agents went to Austin's home. They spoke with him and his mother. They asked Austin questions about his activities on October 5th. Austin was calm. He was cooperative. He said he'd been home sleeping when Jessica was abducted. He had no problem answering their questions. In fact, he voluntarily provided investigators with a DNA sample. He seemed confident. He seemed to believe he'd been careful enough that his DNA wouldn't be found at any crime scene. He thought he'd gotten away with it. The agents noticed Austin was wearing a wooden cross around his neck. They asked him about it. Austin explained that he made wooden crosses as a hobby. He showed no sign of nervousness or guilt. The investigators left his home without any immediate cause for arrest. They sent his DNA sample to the lab, along with hundreds of others they'd collected during the investigation. But the lab made a mistake, a critical, devastating mistake. When processing Austin's DNA sample, technicians mishandled the evidence. The result that came back indicated that Austin's DNA did not match the DNA found on Jessica's belongings or at the crime scenes. Austin Sigg had been cleared. Investigators moved on to other suspects, never knowing that the person responsible for Jessica's death had been sitting right in front of them, confidently providing a DNA sample because he believed his own cleverness would protect him. For several days, Austin went about his life as normal. He attended classes at Arapahoe Community College. He interacted with his mother and his younger brother. He watched news coverage of Jessica's case. He saw the community's grief and the family's anguish, and he said nothing. He did nothing. He let everyone continue suffering while he alone knew the truth. But something was eating at Austin. Whether it was guilt, fear, or simply the weight of what he'd done, something was breaking down inside him. On October 22nd, 12 days after Jessica's remains were discovered, news reports announced that investigators had found a DNA link between Jessica's death and the attempted abduction of the jogger at Kettner Lake. The media reported that police were close to making an arrest. Austin saw these reports. He knew the walls were closing in. He knew it was only a matter of time before investigators realized their mistake with his DNA sample. He knew he was going to be caught. On the night of October 22nd, Austin didn't sleep in his own room. He told his mother he wasn't feeling well and asked if he could sleep in her bed. Mindy Sigg agreed. She had no idea what her son had done. She had no idea that the teenager she'd raised, the child she'd tried to help with therapy and intervention, was responsible for one of the most horrific crimes in Colorado history. The next morning, October 23rd, Austin woke up and told his mother he needed to talk to her. He told her he'd done something terrible. He told her he was a monster. And when Mindy asked if this was about Jessica Ridgway, Austin confirmed it. He confessed to his mother that he had abducted, sexually assaulted, murdered, and dismembered Jessica Ridgway. Imagine being Mindy Sigg in that moment. Imagine having your child, your 17-year-old son, tell you that he's responsible for the death that has terrorized your community for more than 2 weeks. Imagine learning that the little girl whose face has been on every television screen, whose family you've seen pleading for information, whose death has broken the hearts of thousands of people, was killed by your own child. Imagine having to make the decision about what to do with that information. Mindy Sigg made the only choice a moral person could make. That evening, at 7:30 p.m., she called the Westminster Police Department. She reported that her son wanted to turn himself in for Jessica Ridgway's murder. The 911 operator was stunned. After more than 2 weeks of intensive investigation, after thousands of hours of police work, after hundreds of DNA samples and countless interviews, the case was being solved by a confession. By a mother who had the courage to turn in her own child. When police arrived at the Sigg home, they found Mindy sobbing as she embraced Austin. Officers took Austin into custody. They transported him to the police station for questioning, and Austin provided a full, detailed confession. He told investigators everything. He described how he'd gone hunting for a victim that morning. He explained how he'd spotted Jessica walking to school. He detailed how he'd grabbed her and bound her and thrown her into his vehicle. He described what he'd done to her in his bedroom. He explained how he'd killed her and dismembered her body. He told them where he'd hidden parts of her remains. During the confession, Austin provided details that only the killer could know. He told investigators about the wooden cross he'd placed inside Jessica's body. He described the 3 small parallel marks he'd etched into that cross. These details had never been released to the public. Only the killer would know about them. This information corroborated Austin's confession beyond any doubt. Austin also confessed to the attempted abduction at Kettner Lake. He admitted that he'd made homemade chloroform using a recipe he'd found on the internet. He described how he'd attacked the jogger, how he'd tried to subdue her with the chemical-soaked rag, how she'd fought him off and escaped. He explained that after that failed attempt, he decided he needed to find someone he could overpower more easily. Someone smaller, someone weaker, someone like Jessica. When investigators asked Austin why he'd done these things, his answer was chilling in its honesty. He said he was fulfilling sexual urges. He said he'd been fantasizing about abduction, rape, murder, and dismemberment for years. He said that killing Jessica was, quote, a random place, random time, random everything. He said, quote, the second I pulled her into my car, I knew she was dead. Austin didn't try to minimize what he'd done. He didn't try to blame his actions on mental illness or childhood trauma or any other external factor. He acknowledged that he was, in his own words, a monster. He told investigators, quote, there is no better word to describe what I have done than evil. Following Austin's confession, investigators returned to his home with search warrants. They searched every inch of the property, and in the crawl space beneath the house, they found the rest of Jessica's remains. The parts Austin had kept, the parts he hadn't disposed of in public locations. They found her skull. They found other body parts that Austin had stored like trophies. The search of Austin's home also revealed more evidence of his disturbed pathology. In addition to the child pornography and violent sexual material found on his phone and computer, investigators discovered that Austin had been conducting extensive internet searches. Searches about how to make chloroform. Searches about the top 10 places people get abducted. Searches about serial killers and their methods. Searches that revealed months, possibly years, of planning and preparation. Austin Reed Sigg was arrested and charged. Initially held at the Mount View Youth Services Center in Lakewood, Colorado, Austin made his first appearance in Jefferson County Juvenile Court on October 25, 2012. The prosecution immediately declared their intent to try Austin as an adult. His defense attorneys requested and were granted a gag order on case details. On October 30th, Austin was formally charged as an adult. He faced 17 counts in total. 11 counts related to Jessica Ridgway, including first-degree murder after deliberation, second-degree kidnapping, felony murder, sexual assault on a child, and robbery. 6 counts related to the attempted kidnapping at Kettner Lake, including attempted first-degree murder, attempted second-degree kidnapping, attempted sexual assault, and 3 counts of crime of violence. The courtroom proceedings were unlike any the community had witnessed before. Due to safety concerns related to the high-profile nature of the case, only the media and family members of Austin and Jessica were permitted in the courtroom. More than 15 Jefferson County Sheriff deputies were present. The spokesperson for the sheriff's office noted that while no specific threats had been made, the precautions were necessary given the intense emotions surrounding the case. Austin's defense team argued that their client wasn't mature enough to understand the severity of his actions. They presented evidence of a difficult childhood. They noted that Austin's mother had fallen while pregnant with him, that his birth had been complicated, that a vacuum was needed to deliver him, that he'd had medical issues as an infant. They discussed his family history of mental health issues. They argued that Austin was still a child, still developing, still not fully formed as a person. The prosecution countered with devastating effectiveness. They argued that Austin had meticulously planned both the attempted abduction at Kettner Lake and Jessica's murder. They pointed out that the crimes occurred 4 months apart, demonstrating ongoing intent and planning rather than impulsive adolescent behavior. They presented evidence of Austin's extensive research into abduction and murder techniques. They demonstrated that this was not the act of an immature teenager who didn't understand his actions. This was the act of a calculating predator who knew exactly what he was doing and had prepared extensively to do it. Initially, Austin pleaded not guilty. His trial was scheduled to begin on October 1st, 2013, nearly 1 year after Jessica's death. But on September 30th, 2 days before the trial was scheduled to start, Austin's defense attorneys contacted prosecutors with shocking news. Their client wanted to change his plea. He wanted to plead guilty to all charges.